In this lesson, I talk about the irrelevant expert, also known as anonymous authority, and also we delve a little bit into the Dunning-Kruger syndrome. This is one that's really common in our climate negotiation work, almost as common as abusing the person, as in ad hominem argument, or in accusations of hypocrisy. And it can be a frustrating one to deal with. But I think the thing is that if people are citing irrelevant expert or practicing Dunning-Kruger or using anonymous authority, they're actually in the bargaining stage. And that's a good place to be. And we just have to manage it with some tact. So the lesson objectives are to gain familiarity with the irrelevant expert tactic, to recognize how and where it can crop up in climate negotiation, and then to figure out what we're going to do about it all. So who is the irrelevant expert? As I said earlier, this is quite a common tactic in climate negotiation. And what people are trying to do is they're attempting to make their argument much more credible by saying it came from an expert. But in many cases, the expert really isn't an expert. And the thing that makes this much more complicated is that oftentimes the expert can be anonymous. So folks will say things like, my friend's second cousin's brother-in-law, who's a real scientist, said. And so we have to be very careful when we see that sort of sentence construction, that sort of introduction to a statement, because the first question you should be asking is, who are these people? The other approach is an unnamed official at, say, the World Bank or at some utility or in some credible organization. But you'll note that the person that is cited isn't named. Or it can be a famous actor or a PhD in an unrelated field. So we can say that this guy is really a PhD and he said this. And the most insidious of all, the self-proclaimed expert. This is where we get into Dunning-Kruger effect. This is something that I'd never heard of up until about a year ago. I never thought about it. But it is a form of cognitive bias. Believing something that isn't true is true. And in this case, believing that you're an expert when you're not an expert. And here's an example of the work around Dunning-Kruger. These folks discovered that, by survey, more than 88% of American drivers believe they're above average drivers. So think about that for a moment. Only roughly 50% of American drivers can actually be above average. So where do the other people come from? So what happens in Dunning-Kruger is that as we learn more about a topic, our confidence declines. And so what happens is, early on, you think you know a lot, but as you learn more about the topic, you realize you don't know that much at all. And the ultimate outcome is that experts actually underestimate their own expertise. Now, I think the key takeaway from all of this, without turning this into a prolonged lesson around Dunning-Kruger, is that people who know the least about a topic often have the most self-confidence about it. And they're the loudest. So they're the ones we're going to see on social media. These are the folks that create the issues that we have to deal with in our climate negotiation. Now here's a chart of what this actually looks like in practice. And so what you'll see is, as we look at the confidence axis here and the competence axis here, as people learn a little bit, their confidence skyrockets. Now, people who do a lot of work in Dunning-Kruger actually call this the peak of Mount Stupid. But you'll notice that as you start to get more competent in the field, rather than staying at that peak, people decline. And then they fall into the valley of despair. Now, I actually recognize this in my own development as a chemist and an engineer. Early going, when I was in high school, going into university, I thought I knew everything there was to know about physics, about chemistry, about calculus. And then I went into the first year, and by the time I got the second year, I was despairing that I'll never get this stuff because I learned enough to know I don't know very much. But then, you carry on, and you carry on with your training, your education, and we enter into what's called the slope of enlightenment. And at that stage, our confidence starts to increase until finally we gain a lot of knowledge about a topic. And then we reach what the experts call the plateau of sustainability. Now, here's the thing I want you to take away from all of this. You'll notice that the plateau sustainability is less than the peak of Mount Stupid. So even when you are dealing with a true expert, they may not exhibit the same amount of vigor and confidence and pure volume that folks at the peak of Mount Stupid exhibit. Now, here's an example I came across on Facebook of citing the irrelevant expert. Personal example here. I came across a post in Facebook, this was, and it was a friend of mine who does not believe in renewable energy or any of those things. And he shared a post that slammed electric cars. And it was an extremely negative piece. But there was a blatant appeal to an irrelevant expert. What the post said was, if you read this, you'll see that there's this, a real electrical engineer at BC Hydro said that electric cars can't work because it would put too much load on the system. The system would never be able to accommodate it, and everything would break, and it's just going to create no end of problems. So we shouldn't even consider electric cars. Now, I read that and I thought, geez, this is wrong on a number of scores. The first one is, I checked the numbers and I established that the data they were citing was actually incorrect in terms of the load demands of charging electric vehicles and the impact on the systems. And so I did a little bit of number crunching, and I said that those numbers look suspect. And going back on my peer review lesson, I actually thought, I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm not an expert here. So I'm going to share my thoughts, my results with an electrical engineer who I've been working with for 25 years, somebody I've known for a very long time, and who is a very expert electrical engineer. So I took my work and showed it to him, and he said, yeah, that looks right. These numbers are wrong. You're using more correct numbers. And in fact, and he added a whole bunch of new information that I needed to understand the issue. The other reason it was wrong is that it painted a picture of, if we took every vehicle on the road today and replaced them with electric cars and did nothing to the electrical system to accommodate that, then all hell would break loose. And in fact, that's probably true. But the fact of the matter is that's not the way technology works. It enters into a system, it grows over time, the systems accommodate and grow to address that. That's how we ended up with the grids we've got. That's how we ended up with the systems we are operating under right now. So it imposed a significant change on the system without any regard to how that system might respond and how the people who manage it might deal with it. So here's the problem. The post was slanted. It was false and misleading, and it cited somebody we couldn't even go check on. They were anonymous. And from that, we were supposed to conclude that electric vehicles are bad. And unfortunately, in watching how that post was received through my Facebook feeds, is it got shared a lot. A lot of really positive comments on it. People said, finally, somebody's saying it, and all that kind of stuff. So it got a lot of credibility. In fact, it got a lot of credibility with it doing very little work. And it's a common tactic. So we see it all the time. Unfortunately, we actually see it in both sides of the climate negotiation. So we'll actually see folks who are climate advocates citing some expert who said something without actually indicating who they are and where they said it and whether it's peer-reviewed and all the rest of that. So that is a common thing we see on both sides. So I'm not pointing fingers here at one side of the argument or the other. I'm saying it's a tactic we have to deal with when we encounter it. And it's a very lazy tactic because it's used to support a position without having to do any work, without having to provide any evidence. And in fact, it's a way of supporting a position without having to do any thinking at all. So what we need to do is focus on facts. In fact, who presents an argument is less important than the argument itself, the assumptions, observations, and data that support it. That's key. So when I'm dealing with somebody in my climate negotiation and they're reluctant to share those observations, those assumptions, and the data, then I'm a little bit more careful about what I do with what they say to me. Because, we need to do some homework before we start sharing things around. I mean, who said this? What sort of doctor were they actually? Was it a PhD? Was it a PhD in some unrelated field? I'm seeing a lot of commentary on social media by folks who are PhDs in sociology commenting on economics, commenting on climate science and explaining why it's right, why it's wrong, and leaning on their PhD to gain some credibility. Just remember that an expert in one field is not necessarily an expert in another. And to put that into an analogy, so those of you who may have played in a band, if you're really good at playing piano or you're really good at playing violin, and you're asked by your conductor, said, we're kind of short today, can you go over there and can you play bass drum? Well, I may know enough about music to get by, but that does not make me an expert. So we have to do our homework. Does the information make any sense? Now, this is where I would often use the expression, does it pass a sniff test? Does it sound right? Does it feel right? We need to check. And then we can actually identify real experts and ask them. So we need to do some homework and some critical thinking. And then that will protect us from the illegitimate expert. Ultimately, I see this tactic as a scam, and we really can't let ourselves be chumps in all of that. And I have to say, we have to be careful not to ignore real experts. So this is not a discussion about or a plea to ignore people who really do know what they're talking about. These folks have many years of experience in the field, and they have access to information that the rest of us just don't see, and often we just don't understand. But, be careful about name, notoriety, credentials, or other superficial criteria that don't actually prove the argument. What matters is the knowledge people possess, their ability to explain it, and their ability to support their position. Now, as I said at the very beginning of this lesson, this is a form of bargaining. People, when they're doing this, are no longer denying that we have a climate issue. And they seem to be controlling anger and depression, but they're not yet into acceptance. And what they're trying to do is find a way to disprove our arguments about climate change and find somebody who will tell them that, everything is okay, you're doing fine. And that makes the problem go away, and they can go back to life as normal. So what's going on? Most people who are appealing to the irrelevant expert are actually trying to come to grips with climate change. And as always, we have to find our common ground. And in this case, this is a time when we can share our facts. We can talk about, what the data really says and how it shows it and that sort of thing. So this is a time when we can have that discussion. Our do's and don'ts. We carry on with yes, open listening. Yes, patience. Staying on topic. Understanding our own position so we know our core message and we can repeat that. Finding common ground. And once again, explaining the science and explaining why it's important. We have to be careful not to respond with anger. This is frustrating, and when we respond with anger, we push folks back down into that denial, depression, anger phase of climate negotiation. So we're moving backwards. So we actually have to maintain some sense of calm in all of this. And that may be the most difficult thing of all for most of us. And finally, I would say, Don't yield to the temptation to put up your own expert. I've fallen into this trap a number of times over the years. Somebody cites an expert, they don't name who that expert is, and then you find yourself saying, yeah, well, I actually know an expert, and they don't agree. And then what you have is dueling anonymous experts. No information is really being shared, and it's just a very frustrating and kind of aggravating sort of scenario. So don't fall into that, but do share facts. And finally, don't get distracted by the entertaining argument. This is something that we do know that we can do. I'm going to show them wrong, and and that they're wrong, and I'm going to carry on with this, and I'm going to win. That's entertaining, not very productive. So when we go back to the fallacies we're considering, are common or still the same: open listening, patience, understanding your position, knowing your core message, seeking common ground. And the thing we add is share some vetted facts. So know your stuff and share what you do know. And don't get into some sort of name-calling thing trying to show that they don't really know who their experts are. That's not going to help. It's going to be a slow go, this one, because people who are leaning on the irrelevant expert really want to believe that message. So it's showing them the different set of facts. It's going to be a slow, but it's the way to proceed in this case. So what did we cover in this lesson? We talked about the irrelevant expert tactics. We talked about how it crops up in climate negotiations, how frustrating it can be, that sort of thing. And finally, we talked about what to do about it in terms of sharing real facts with folks. Share your comments below. We'll review them and share them with the rest of the participants of the course. And we can carry on our discussions that way.